What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved and enigmatic actors walks onto a brightly lit daytime television set, expecting nothing more than a routine promotional stop, only to find himself at the center of one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations of his career? What begins as a standard publicity appearance slowly transforms into a moment so tense, so unexpected, and so widely debated that it sends shockwaves across social media, divides loyal fans, and sparks heated discussions about media ethics, celebrity accountability, and the thin line between journalism and ambush. This is the story of Johnny Depp's controversial appearance on The View, segment that was supposed to spotlight his latest creative project, but instead became a defining television clash with longtime co-host Joy Behar. What unfolded during that broadcast left viewers stunned and turned what should have been a lighthearted conversation into a dramatic exchange that many still reference as one of the show's most uncomfortable moments. Before the cameras rolled that morning, everything seemed perfectly normal. Depp had arrived at the studio in good spirits, dressed in his signature layered-style dark jacket, carefully chosen accessories, silver rings catching the studio lights. He had been doing a string of promotional interviews for his newest film, a project he felt deeply passionate about, like most actors on press tours. He expected familiar questions, insights into his character, behind-the-scenes anecdotes, reflections on working with co-stars, and perhaps a few humorous personal stories. To keep daytime audiences entertained, the studio atmosphere was upbeat. Audience members buzzed with anticipation, whispering excitedly as stagehands made final adjustments. The energy shifted instantly when Depp stepped onto the set. Applause erupted. For decades, he had cultivated a unique screen presence, whether portraying eccentric outsiders or dramatic leads, and that mystique translated into real-life charisma. He smiled warmly, waving modestly as he took his seat at the curved table beside the hosts. Leading the welcome was Whoopi Goldberg, whose calm and seasoned presence often sets the tone for the panel. "Welcome back," she said with a friendly warmth that immediately relaxed the room. Depp responded graciously, expressing appreciation for the invitation and acknowledging the supportive audience. For a few brief moments, it appeared that the segment would unfold exactly as planned, cordial, polished, and promotional, but something in the dynamic shifted almost imperceptibly. As pleasantries concluded and the discussion prepared to move forward, Joy Behar leaned slightly toward the table. Her body language was deliberate. Papers lay stacked neatly before her, and her expression was focused, more investigative than conversational. Viewers who had watched the show for years could sense when Behar intended to pivot into sharper territory. This was one of those moments. Instead of beginning with the film, she interjected, "So, Johnny," she began, her tone noticeably firmer than the earlier exchanges. "Let's talk about your recent legal troubles and how they may have affected your ability to find work in Hollywood." The question landed heavily. In an instant, the lively studio atmosphere shifted into a thick, almost tangible silence. Audience members who had been smiling moments earlier stiffened in their seats. A few exchanged uncertain glances. The promotional tone dissolved, replaced by tension that cameras could not entirely mask. Depp's posture subtly changed, though he maintained composure. There was a visible recalibration, a careful pause before responding. For years, his personal life had been scrutinized across headlines, courtroom broadcasts, and endless online commentary. While public figures often expect difficult questions, timing and context matter. On a program known primarily for its conversational warmth, the abrupt pivot felt jarring. The silence stretched just long enough to be noticed. Behind the table, even the other hosts appeared momentarily uncertain. Live television thrives on unpredictability, but it also depends on balance. Was this responsible journalism, a necessary question, or an aggressive detour that overshadowed the purpose of the visit? Social media would later explode with divided opinions. Some viewers praised Behar for addressing the elephant in the room, arguing that public figures cannot selectively discuss only the comfortable parts of their lives. Others criticized the approach as confrontational and poorly timed, suggesting that a promotional interview was not the appropriate setting for such an intense line of questioning. But in that moment before the commentary, before the trending hashtags, there was only the studio, the cameras, and a question hanging in the air. The interview had just taken a turn no one in the audience had anticipated. What was supposed to be routine had become something far more volatile, and as Depp prepared to answer, it became clear that this would not be just another daytime television appearance. It would be a moment dissected, debated, and remembered long after the credits rolled. This was not the kind of gentle, lighthearted opening question that most celebrity guests receive during a daytime talk show appearance. There was no playful anecdote, no humorous icebreaker, no gradual transition into heavier topics. Instead, the tone shifted abruptly from cordial to confrontational. The warmth that had filled the studio moments earlier seemed to evaporate. Even the studio lights, still bright and unwavering, suddenly felt harsher in the charged silence that followed. Johnny Depp's smile, which had moments before appeared relaxed and effortless, faltered ever so slightly. It was not a dramatic reaction, no visible flash of anger or open frustration, but a subtle tightening around the eyes, a faint pause before he responded. Years in the public, I had trained him to manage such moments. He had faced relentless press cycles, invasive headlines, and courtroom scrutiny under the unforgiving glare of cameras. Composure, in many ways, had become second nature to him. Well, Joy, he began carefully, his tone measured and diplomatic. I'm actually here to talk about my new film. It's a really exciting project, one I'm incredibly proud of, and I think audiences are going to love it. His response was calm, almost gentle, an attempt to steer the conversation back to its intended purpose. This was a promotional appearance. After all, actors routinely dedicate weeks to press tours, carefully aligning messaging around their creative work. The expectation is clear. Highlight the film, share behind-the-scenes stories, build anticipation, but Joy Behar was not ready to let the subject change. Surely you can understand why people might be hesitant to support your work. Given everything that's come out, she pressed, her voice firm, cutting through his attempt to redirect. Don't you think you owe the public some kind of explanation? The question hung heavily in the air. The studio audience, once lively and supportive, grew noticeably quieter. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. On the panel, reactions were subtle but unmistakable. Sunny Hostin shifted in her seat, her posture signaling unease as she sensed the tension escalating. Sarah Haynes glanced down at her notes, perhaps searching for the next scheduled question, perhaps simply avoiding eye contact during the intensifying exchange. At the center of the table, Whoopi Goldberg attempted to recalibrate the conversation. Joy, maybe we should, she began, her tone suggesting a desire to balance the discussion, to prevent this segment from spiraling too far from its promotional focus. But Joy cut her off sharply. I think this is exactly what we should be discussing, she insisted. This is The View, and we don't shy away from tough questions. The statement was bold, almost declarative, a reminder of the show's identity as a platform for candid discussion. Yet the intensity with which it was delivered amplified the discomfort. Already simmering beneath the surface, the audience could feel it, the panel could feel it, and undoubtedly, Depp could feel it. Then came the sharper edge. Johnny, you've made millions from fans, especially women, and now many of them feel betrayed. What do you say to them? There it was, the confrontation fully realized. Depp's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a fleeting movement, the kind that cameras might miss, but attentive viewers would catch. He inhaled slowly before responding. Years of media training had prepared him for difficult interviews. But there was something distinctly aggressive about the rapid-fire questioning. The phrasing felt less like inquiry and more like indictment. I say that people should focus on the art, not the artist's personal life, he replied carefully, choosing each word with precision. I've always tried to bring characters to life that entertain people, that resonate in some way. That's what I'm here to talk about, the work. It was a classic defense, the separation of art from artist, performance from persona. For decades, audiences had embraced his ability to disappear into roles, To transform himself into unforgettable characters, he was appealing to that legacy, reminding viewers of the creative contributions rather than the controversies. But Joy was relentless, but you can't separate the two, can you? She shot back almost immediately. When you ask people to pay to see you in theaters, you're asking them to support you personally. And given your track record with relationships, don't you think that's a problem? A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. The whispers were no longer subtle. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding drama. What had begun as a routine daytime segment was now undeniably confrontational. The energy in the room changed dramatically. The earlier warmth, the laughter, the applause had been replaced by a tense anticipation. Live television thrives on authenticity, but it also carries risk. Every word spoken in that moment would be clipped, shared, dissected across social platforms within minutes. The exchange was no longer simply about a film. It had become a broader debate about accountability, celebrity culture, public perception, and the expectations placed upon those who live in the spotlight. For some viewers, Joy's persistence represented necessary journalistic courage. For others, it felt like an ambush during what was meant to be a professional appearance. Focused on artistic work, at the table, the balance of the show teetered. Whoopi's earlier attempt to moderate had been cut short. Sonny and Sarah remained visibly reserved, and Depp, though still composed, seemed increasingly aware that this conversation was veering far from its original path. What was unfolding was not just an interview. It was a televised standoff between two fundamentally different perspectives. One arguing that public figures owe explanations for their personal controversies, and the other insisting that creative work should stand independent of private turmoil. As the murmurs grew louder and the atmosphere thickened with tension, it became clear that the segment had crossed an invisible line. The friendly promotional visit had transformed into a high-stakes confrontation, one that would likely dominate headlines and spark polarized reactions long after the broadcast ended. "My track record," Johnny Depp repeated, the words rolling slowly off his tongue as if he were testing their weight. There was a noticeable shift in his tone, now a faint but undeniable edge that hadn't been there before. The relaxed charm he had carried onto the set earlier had begun to fade, replaced by something more guarded, more deliberate. His posture straightened, shoulders squaring slightly as he faced Joy Behar across the table. "Joy," he continued, keeping his voice controlled but firm, "I came here to discuss my work, not to be put on trial for my personal life." The choice of words "put on trial" hung heavily in the studio air. It wasn't accidental. It evoked scrutiny, judgment, and a sense of prosecution rather than conversation. For a fleeting moment, there was silence. Even the audience seemed unsure how to respond. Joy leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with an expression that many would later describe as smug, others as resolute. "Well, maybe that's the problem," she replied coolly. "Maybe you think you can just charm your way out of responsibility for your actions." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. On the panel, Sunny Hostin visibly attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Her tone was lighter, carefully neutral. "Johnny, tell us about working with your co-stars on this new project," she interjected gently. "What was that experience like?" It was a classic de-escalation tactic, a pivot toward professional territory. Something structured and familiar, a reminder of why he was there in the first place. But before Depp could even begin to respond, Joy cut in. "We'll get to that," she said dismissively, waving her hand slightly as though brushing aside an irrelevant detail. "First, I want Johnny to explain why the audience should trust him again." The word trust sharpened the confrontation. It reframed the entire exchange from promotional interview to moral inquisition. Depp's composure, so carefully maintained, began to show cracks, not dramatic ones. He was still measured, still articulate, but the strain was visible now. The corners of his mouth tightened. His eyes hardened. "Joy, I'm an actor," he replied, each word pronounced clearly. "I make movies. People can choose to watch them or not. That's how this works. I'm not running for president here." A few nervous laughs flickered from scattered corners of the audience. but they quickly died out. The tension was too thick. But you're asking for people's money and emotional investment, Joy countered immediately. And frankly, many viewers are wondering if you deserve it. The word deserve landed like a challenge. Round the studio, the shift was palpable. Camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, zooming in for close-ups. Years of experience had taught them to recognize when something significant was unfolding live on air. Producers likely leaned closer to their monitors backstage. The atmosphere had moved beyond awkwardness into something combustible. The other hosts exchanged glances brief, uneasy signals of shared discomfort. But Joy appeared energized. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a sense that she believed this confrontation was necessary, perhaps even overdue. You know what, Joy, Depp said finally, his voice steady but carrying unmistakable steel. I think you made up your mind about me before I even walked in here. This isn't an interview. It's an ambush. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience, soft gasps, hushed murmurs. The word ambush reframed the narrative again. Now it was about fairness, intent, and motive. It's accountability, Joy shot back without hesitation. Something you seem to have trouble with. That was the moment everything shifted. There was a subtle but dramatic change in Depp's demeanor. The easygoing mystique, the carefully curated public persona, those layers seemed to thin. His voice dropped, not louder but quieter, lower, more controlled in a way that felt far more intense. Accountability, he repeated slowly. From someone who makes a living tearing people down on television, the line cut sharply across the table. That's rich, Joy. The audience gasped audibly this time. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was shock. This was not the soft-spoken, evasive version of Johnny Depp many viewers expected to see in interviews. This was someone pushing back. Joy's eyes widened, but instead of retreating, she leaned into it. There was almost a spark of satisfaction in her reaction, as though the response validated her strategy. Oh, so now you're attacking me personally? She replied, her tone laced with feigned innocence. She turned slightly toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The minute someone asks Johnny Depp a tough question, he becomes defensive and lashes out. I'm not lashing out, Depp responded, gripping the arms of his chair, not violently, but firmly enough for the movement to register. I'm pointing out the hypocrisy of someone who profits from controversy lecturing me about accountability. The accusation was pointed. It challenged not just Joy's questioning, but the broader ecosystem of televised debate, where confrontation drives ratings and outrage fuels engagement. The studio seemed divided. Some audience members nodded subtly, others looked stunned. The other hosts remained tense, caught between supporting their colleague and preventing the segment from spiraling further. What had begun as a disagreement was now a philosophical clash about media, power, and public judgment. Joy framed herself as a voice of accountability, representing viewers demanding answers. Depp framed himself as the target of selective outrage, questioning the ethics of public interrogation disguised as conversation. The air felt electric. Every word carried amplified weight. Social media feeds were likely lighting up in real time, viewers choosing sides before the segment had even ended. For years, Depp had cultivated an image of enigmatic detachment during interviews, rarely reactive, often elusive. But here, on this set, under the bright lights of daytime television, that detachment had eroded. The confrontation was no longer subtle, it was explicit, and everyone in the room knew they had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. Whoopi Goldberg tried once again to regain control of the rapidly spiraling conversation. Her voice, usually steady and commanding, carried a hint of urgency now. Okay, let's all take a breath here, she said, lifting her hands slightly in a calming gesture, attempting to reset the energy at the table before it tipped into something irreparable. But Joy Behar wasn't ready to let the moment cool. No, she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively as if brushing aside an inconvenience. I want to hear what Johnny has to say. Go ahead, Johnny, tell us how you really feel about critics. Her tone was sharp, almost taunting, and the invitation didn't sound like one meant for thoughtful reflection. It sounded like a challenge. Johnny Depp leaned forward slowly, the relaxed, almost whimsical presence he had carried at the beginning of the segment was gone. In its place was a man visibly frustrated, his patience worn thin under the relentless scrutiny. His hands rested firmly on the table, his gaze fixed directly across at Joy. "You want to know how I feel?" he began, his voice lower but carrying more force than before. "I feel like I walked into a courtroom instead of a talk show. I feel like you decided to prosecute me the moment I sat down, and you're not interested in anything I actually have to say." The comparison to a courtroom was deliberate. It underscored the adversarial tone that had overtaken what was supposed to be a conversational format. The studio audience shifted uneasily, sensing that this exchange had moved far beyond typical daytime debate. Joy's response came swiftly and colder than before. "Maybe because what you have to say isn't worth hearing," she replied, with a tight, almost cruel smile. "Maybe people are tired of your sob stories and your victim complex." A collective gasp rippled through the studio. The cruelty of the phrasing was unmistakable. On the panel, the discomfort was written plainly across faces. Sarah Haynes stared down at her hands, avoiding eye contact entirely, her posture stiff. With embarrassment, Sunny Hostin glanced repeatedly toward the producers off camera, her eyes conveying silent pleas for someone to intervene before the situation became irrecoverable. But the cameras continued to roll, and Joy continued to push. "Victim complex," Depp repeated, his voice rising now, no longer carefully measured. The edge in his tone sharpened into open indignation. "You sit here every day judging people you've never met, making assumptions about situations you know nothing about, and you want to lecture me on victim complexes?" The audience was no longer murmuring, they were frozen. Every word seemed amplified by the tension in the room. "I know what I've read," Joy shot back. "I know what the courts have said. I know what multiple people have testified to under oath." There was an unmistakable finality in her delivery, as if she were presenting a closing argument. "Do you?" Depp fired back suddenly, then, in a burst of motion that startled nearly everyone present, he stood up abruptly. The legs of his chair scraped loudly against the studio floor, rolling backward with a jarring sound that cut through the silence. The physical movement shifted the atmosphere instantly. What had been verbal was now physical, not violent, but charged with intensity. "Or do you know what gets ratings?" he continued, standing tall now, looking down at the table. "Because that seems to be all you care about." The studio fell into a deep, suffocating silence. The only audible sound was the faint mechanical hum of cameras and studio equipment capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Crew members froze in place. Producers likely exchanged panicked glances behind the scenes. Joy remained seated, but her posture changed subtly. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was a flicker of uncertainty, and her expression a recognition that the escalation might have gone further than intended. "Sit down, Johnny," she said, attempting to reclaim authority, her voice firmer but less confident than before. "You're being ridiculous." "I'm being ridiculous?" Depp let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound echoing awkwardly. In the tense studio, there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "I came here to talk about a film that employed hundreds of people," he said, gesturing emphatically, "a project that gave jobs to crew members, artists, technicians, people who worked incredibly hard. A film that might bring joy to audiences for 2 hours of escape." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with anger barely held in check, and instead, he continued, "You want to relitigate my entire personal life on national television, and I'm the one being ridiculous?" The rhetorical question lingered heavily. For a moment, even Joy had no immediate response. The clash was no longer just about accountability or art versus artist. It had become about fairness, about platform power, about whether a talk show interview had crossed into something resembling public prosecution. Depp framed himself as someone ambushed under the guise of conversation. Joy framed herself as someone demanding answers on behalf of viewers. But now, standing in the middle of the set, the visual symbolism was undeniable. A celebrity pushed to his breaking point in front of a live audience. The tension was thick enough to feel physically oppressive. No one moved. No one spoke. This was no longer uncomfortable television.